It's such a joy to be here with Andy and to see his book out. And here is the book, looking absolutely beautiful, really nice design, which I'm sure Andy is pleased with too. And its title is Faith, Hope and Charity, English Neighbourhoods Between 1500 and 1640. And as Andy says in the book, as you say, Andy, it's the social history of an idea. And I wanted to start off by asking you to tell us a bit about what brought you to the idea, and what brought you to doing this book in the way that you've done it.
Right, thanks, Laura, and thanks to Liz and everyone at CP for setting up this event. It kind of emerged organically out of a book that was going to be about both everyday life, patterns of social relations, forms of social integration, alongside social conflict, riot, litigation, those sort of issues. But as I was writing the book, I started writing what was going to be a chapter about neighbourhood, and the chapter grew and grew and grew to the extent that I had to write to Liz at CUP and say, that book I was going to write for you, actually, can we cut it in half and write 2 books, which Liz was very kind about and has allowed me to do that. So there's a sort of successor volume that I'm working on at the moment, which is much darker, and which is about conflicts over space, power, gender, resources, those sort of issues. But this book started then as a chapter and just sort of exponentially grew as I thought more and more about that concept of neighbourhood, what it meant. So it was, the initial parts of the book are therefore quite linguistic, in that I was searching for different usages of the term over the course of a period.
It's been such a touchstone for early modern historians, and I think sometimes quite a lazy one. I'm sure I'm guilty of falling back on it as a way of, for me sometimes it's always been a way of understanding who are all these other people in the court case. They must be neighbours, and I'm sure they aren't always. They must be, and so I generally use it really to think about locality and to assume that it's people who are very, very close. But I'm wondering if I'm right about that, and we should be conceiving it in a much broader way. It's not just people who are physically close by.
Yeah, well, within Christian doctrine, the idea is that all human beings are one another's neighbours. That was something that came out quite strongly from the sort of theological writings that I was looking at. And the godly, the Puritans in particular, were quite keen on that as a concept. For all that Puritans were often upheld as the enemies of neighbourhood, because they were seen as a divisive presence, they were seriously into the idea, the social ideal of neighbourhood, as one of the ways in which Christians ought to relate to one another. So there is this bigger concept of the neighbour being everyone, all Christians together. In terms of everyday life, though, as you know from all the church court depositions that you've read, for domestic dangers, for example, people use neighbourhood in a much more limited, specific sense, spatially limited. So in the countryside, people talk about neighbourhood as equivalent to the country, by which I think they mean something around about 5 miles radius from where they live, where they trade, where they gossip, where they might marry someone, where they lend money, where they might be politically or organisationally involved in running a broader community. So that idea of country is often synonymous with neighbourhood in the countryside. And I wonder, again, looking at your book, Domestic Dangers, and Ian Archer and Paul Griffiths on London, I wonder about the extent to which streets and lanes within cities constitute neighbourhoods. In Norwich, for example, Norwich is a city built around what we call courts, which run off the main residences. Now, none of those courts survived because they were mostly destroyed in slum clearance, or in the 30s and 40s and 50s, or they were bombed out of existence by the Luftwaffe in 1942. So none of the lanes survive, but we do have a lot of photographic evidence of these very old buildings, these insanitary old buildings where people live their lives, and that seems, the courtyard in urban communities seems to me to be another locus of neighbourhood. I don't know if you'd agree with that from the London evidence.
Yes, I would, very much so. And what's interesting about the London courts is some of them actually have a gate at the end which gets closed at the same time as the city gates get closed in this. So they are very enclosed. Of course, they only have one way in, so you really can cut them off. And the sort of process of bringing food in and out and bringing water in and out can be quite divisive. I was very struck reading some of the book that I started off thinking about the idea of neighbourhood, but of course your neighbourhoods are very specific. It's a very densely local book, as all your work is, and maybe allows us to start putting together a kind of comparative sense of what being a neighbour and living in a neighbourhood meant in different parts of the country and different types of urban and rural community. And of course, so much of my work has been on London, but it made me wonder about how we use. I've always wondered how we can use neighbourhood for London, and I very much agree with what you say about the lack of anonymity in an early modern city. But it's not. It doesn't tear people away from these structures of belonging and from these habits of being embedded in those who are close to them. But I wondered if you wanted to say a bit about your thoughts about cities and towns and how urban communities work. So I think this is you spend much more time on towns and urban life in this project than you have in others.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Because at the back of my mind, this question sort of kept coming back to me: the extent to which that strong sense of locality and neighbourhood that you have in the countryside is transferred into the urban context. And particularly London, because as you know, London's going through this exponential growth over the period that the book covers. And there is that argument that we're aware of, that London becomes a location of a sort of urban anomie, of placelessness, which I always, again, referring back to your first book, Domestic Dangers seem to represent an entirely different picture of London life from that of urban anomie, where people's reputation really, really seriously matters to them, and their standing within their locality really matters to them, perhaps in a way that's even more intense in cities than in the countryside. So the urban context, the city that I knew best in terms of the records is Norwich. I'm hoping to start work on some of the London stuff once COVID is over and we can get back to archives. But the Norwich records are really, really great. And obviously Norwich is Britain's second city. It's got a population of about 30,000 by the early 17th century. So it's a fairly substantial urban community. And I can show you this map of Norwich, which came out in 1958 and is the first ever published map of a provincial town in Britain. And it depicts the city of Norwich physically is as large as the city of London, but obviously has a much lesser population. So you can see in Cunningham's map all the open fields that are actually within the walls of a city. Yeah. So the division between urban and rural, and up on the east side of the city is Mousehold Heath, which is intercommoned both by the city and by the surrounding rural neighbourhoods. And it stretches out 12 miles to the Norfolk Broads in those days. So the division between urban and rural, at least in Norwich, seemed to me to be less stark than is often assumed. And part of the problem is that a lot of early modernists either do rural stuff or do urban stuff, don't do the two together. So we can't always see the interconnections.
And of course, many of the majority of the early modern urban population came from rural areas and must have brought those understandings of neighbourhood with them. And I think you convey the idea of mobility and the importance of kind of moving around the country from from place to place with them. What also really strikes me about this book is you've had an eye, particularly in your sort of work over the last 15 years, you've had an eye for the darker side of the relations between people and the power structures of early modern England. And just as people on one side have been arguing for the importance of negotiation and resistance, we have you coming up saying they were being ground down, people are on their knees. So much like that. I mean, there is that, but there's a lot of cohesion in this book. There was a lot of stories about cohesion rather than separation. How did that happen? And yeah, how did that happen?
Well, I wanted perversely to argue against myself. I wanted to suggest that perhaps there are ways in which everyday life is constituted in a way that allows, to use contemporary terminology, love amongst neighbours, that could cross class lines and cross gender lines, and presented a different perspective on early modern society than the much darker stuff that I'd written in my 30s and 40s. So my first book about the peak mining communities of the peak was essentially about lower class agency. Something similar with the second book with Polgrave. The third book about Kett's Rebellion was about defeat, really. It was about the implications of the defeat of the rebels at Mousehold in 1549 and the way that set off shockwaves within East Anglian society that proved disabling to popular politics. So that was, you're quite right, that was quite a dark book. But I just decided I wanted to get cheerful, and perhaps to give a different angle. So I'm not saying that the stuff that I wrote when I was younger was in some way wrong empirically. I suppose what I'd say is I just wanted to kind of take it in a different direction and to try to think about socially integrative forces, while recognising nonetheless those hard social boundaries, those hard social structures that people are living in. So the book does end on a sort of rather bleak note, but because I wanted to reassert at the end a recognition that this is still quite a hard society. If you're poor, if you're marginal, it's a difficult world to be in. But it's a world that's sort of enlivened and given meaning around the concept of neighbourhood that makes people feel kind of good about themselves and their communities.
So it's really about feelings. Are we thinking a bit more about the history of emotions here? Is it really about how it feels to live in this kind of society? I was sort of thinking about the balance of those ideas of neighbourhood and love and friendship with the polarising of society and how that felt economically. And it's hard not to make comparisons with the time. Indeed, it's helpful to make comparisons with the times that we're living through at the moment, because in many ways it seems that the response to COVID has been to undermine all our closest bonds, all our bonds of neighbourhood, and much of our potential for exercising faith, hope, and charity. But the feeling side of it is still there. So I wonder if what you're writing is putting in something of the missing side of the feelings of those ideas, and how possibly living in this very hierarchical, polarized society still has some feelings of positivity and lovingness that sometimes we forget to historicize because there's so little written about it from the people that you're most interested in.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think I have been influenced by the last kind of 10 years of work in the history of emotion, has sort of impacted on me, because you're quite right. A large part of the book is about the way that people feel about each other and the way that they feel about the communities they're living in, and sometimes they hate each other. Sometimes these visceral social conflicts that wash up, you know, sometimes between people of the same social status, sometimes between gentry and common people. So those feelings can be black and dark, or they can be about commensality, about, you know, all those examples that you give in Domestic Dangers of and elsewhere in your work, of people drinking together to seal their friendship after an argument, after they're brought together by their neighbours. There was an example I came across annoyingly a few weeks ago, which would have been great for the book, which was from Pontefract Church in 1512, and it was a case at Common Pleas over defamation, where one neighbour had accused another neighbour of being a heretic, by which I assume he means a lollard. But the neighbours get together in the parish church, in the lady chapel of the parish church, and try to settle the conflicts between the two of them. And the one guy wants to settle the conflicts, but the other guy insists that the man is a heretic. But, you know, that sort of very charged environment of the parish church, it must have been a really sort of extreme moment. So I wish that I'd found that a year ago, because it would have gone great within the book.
It sounds like, I mean, I would assume that the building of the church and the structure of the church itself, as well as the parish community, is very central to the way that neighbourhood is experienced.
Yeah. And there's interesting archaeology around that. There's a really, I don't know if you know Matthew Johnson's book, An Archaeology of Capitalism. He argues that just as in the countryside, just as in the rural landscape, enclosure is fencing off land and parceling off commodifying resources, but hitherto have been collective, to effectively privatising them. What Johnson argues is that in the countryside, within the parish church, something similar is happening with the establishment of church pews, within which wealthier inhabitants sit, in order spatially to kind of demarcate a hierarchy of the parish church, kind of mapped out within the church. And again, there's lots of church court cases, as you know, with neighbours coming to sometimes to fisticuffs over who gets to sit where, because it's important to them that they are seen as significant figures in their local community. And when that gets challenged, they get very upset.
I was just reading again a case I'm very fond of from a Somerset parish, Creech, I think, where a bunch of women are engaged in an argument about pews, and behind it is the fact that one of them's son has been drinking with the other one's daughter, and they're not happy about the other one isn't happy about it, but she accuses the other woman of coming into the church staring like a lion. And I've never understood what it must be, but this description is not just where you sit in the church, it's how you walk to your pew and who you shove as you get to it. It's hard not to be drawn to the negative side of all that, which brings me, of course, onto the question of gender. And I really like the way that you try all the way through to think about structures of gender and power and how they interface with these other with these other feelings and experiences. And we've got quite a lot of we've got a growing historiography about which classes around the idea of female authority in the neighbourhood, and that the neighbourhood actually gave women, and particularly around reputation, gave women some sort of stake in governing it or semi-governing it and monitoring reputation and having their own. You talk as well about these clusters of female community, particularly around birth. It seemed to be almost a sort of parallel neighbourhood. But I think one of the places where it really struck me, are absolutely right to bring out the importance of heterosocial relations, is in marital violence, where both men and women seem to intervene or try and intervene in matters which we might think to be private.
Yeah. Well, I did try to. That was one of the forces that shaped neighbourhood, along with class, along with locality, along with landscape. Gender is a fundamental determinant of the ways in which people thought about themselves and the communities that they inhabited. And one of the questions for me was the extent to which, for example, in working patterns, men and women worked in different zones, different physical sites, and doing different kinds of work, which I know Jane Whittle's working on now as well. But I picked one of the real references from Domestic Dangers, so that really interesting article about women and gossip in, is it Oriel in Aragon? Women and Gossip in the Spanish Village, published in the 70s, which is a really interesting piece. And what it suggests is that in late Francoite Spain, there were quite sharp divisions between men's worlds and women's worlds. And that was something that I wanted to kind of interrogate a little bit. And it seemed to me that sometimes early modern society can be very gendered in that way, men inhabiting one world, women inhabiting another. But then at other times, men and women can come together. For example, harvest festivals are one example. Harvest work is another. It's part of the exigencies of getting in the harvest. That's where gender divisions, I think, break down in terms of working lives, and men and women are working together in harvest fields, albeit sometimes doing different kinds of work.
And let's think about artisanal households as well, where we have men and women, where we have young, particularly, I mean, through that period of youth, where we have young men and women working in part of the same space for at least part of the time. And particularly, I guess one of those moments is sitting around the family table at the end of the day, or the middle, whatever time of the day, that the politics of the dinner table, where the separations are more around age and power than they are around youth.
Yeah, I should probably have said more about age in the book.
I was wondering about age, yes, about what, because from your work on custom, I have a strong sense of the power of age, particularly, but not only for old men, in being able to explain how the world worked and to sort of share your extensive knowledge of customary life and memory. One of my questions is, does dependence on poor relief, which is likely to increase as you get older and likely to be higher for women, much likely to be higher for women and poor widows and so on, does that get in the way of being seen as a good neighbour?
Yeah, it's a great question, isn't it? Sometimes from a church, I did quite a lot of work on the Durham Church Court material. In fact, it was one of the things that Durham was designed to work on that stuff, because Keith Wrightson had told me it was so good, and it is good, and it's quite eccentric for Durham Church Courts. They're quite different from kind of stuff you get in for example, the Norfolk Diocese, which is much more sort of samey.
Every church court is eccentric.
I know, it's odd, isn't it?
They're very reflective. I mean, of different places, different clerks' interests, different court habits. Somerset ones are completely nuts, but anyway, yeah.
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah. So sorry, I've lost contact. We were talking about age, weren't we?
Yeah.
So the Durham Church Courts. Oh no, poor relief. You were talking about poor relief.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, there are examples within the Durham Church Courts of people saying of their neighbours that they are poor men and yet their neighbour, which suggests quite strongly. Just quite strongly that neighbourhood trumps class in some situations. But I think, again, Keith Wrightson makes his point in English Societies, but 1982 book, that what the Poor Law Acts do is solidify the power of middling groups within local society. And I think that the Poor Law, after the 1598 Act, becomes a really sharp demarcator within a lot of communities. You know, that stuff that Steve Hindle's written about, for example, about paupers wearing badged clothing to mark
Yeah.
them out within the parish.
Yeah.
So it's one of the poor relief is funny because on the one hand, it's something that is about neighbourhood, in that it's about helping the poor, everyone chipping in, everyone working together. In another way, though, it can be very divisive for those people who are denied poor relief for whatever reason.
Yes, absolutely. And actually, that makes me think of Brodie Waddell's work on petitions, and his idea, which I think is very powerful now, of a petitioning culture in which people articulate individually their particular grievances, which are often around poor relief and their failure to get it and their particular needs. And I wonder if that's a sort of parallel story of this individual, which is rather more individualist, because in order to be a good petitioner, to have a successful petitioner, you specifically have to say that you've fallen out of the realm of neighbourhood and neighbourhood charity. Even though you've been a good neighbour, you're not getting enough back, and you need the parish or you need the quarter sessions to step in.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Brodie's project is really interesting, and it's going to produce some really fascinating results working through those quarter sessions petitions.
Yes, I don't know if anybody attending is interested, but the petitions for that project are all digitised on the britishhistoryac.uk website, so you can actually search through them. Fantastic material for dissertations and even just for general interest.
Yeah, it's great material. Yeah.
So one of the other things I wanted to ask you, a much more mundane question. This feels like one of those books that is absolutely crammed full of the riches of references that you've picked up over a long career of research. How on earth did you get it all into place? I'm remembering the article, Keith Thomas's reflective article for the LRB on his method of putting the references in the envelopes and having an envelope for every chapter, and what happens to that method in the digital age. How did you get the material together? How did your notes and your references turn into a book?
Yeah, well, I've got this perverse method that I developed when I was an undergraduate. In those days, I used to have a card index, which subject indexed all my references in ranks of files, and that was how I wrote my PhD. When we first met each other, all that time ago.
I had a database. We're exactly the same age. Let's find out.
Yeah. So I couldn't understand how to make a database in those days, and I was really pretty computer illiterate. So all of my first book, which used a lot of statistics to chart things like landowning patterns and divisions of wealth and poverty and rural industrialization, all that sort of stuff, was done with 2 big boxes of card indexes with 2,000 Derbyshire miners and their wives in, their widows in, and that was how I did the first book. But again, I had this subject index which I used, and I basically transferred the idea of a card index, of a subject index, into Microsoft Word. So every time I go, the way that I work is that, let's say I'm working on a church court deposition and I get a case about sexual slander, and somebody uses phrases about, say, men's honour. So that would then get cut and pasted into a section called masculinity, a document called masculinity that was randomly collected from all these other different sources. And what I then do when I get to say masculinity is jiggle it all around so that it makes some kind of narrative sense, and then write it up. So it's kind of like, it's like building a wall with bricks. I don't know if that's a very good
how to make a card index, so that makes a lot more sense.
Yeah.
Please do submit your questions into the chat box, and we can pick them up. Let me come back to that question about gender. where did you get to? But once you were nearing the end. Oh, I'm going to come back to. I'll come back to my gender question, because somebody's asked in the chat box, what difference? It's a really good question actually, and very present focused. What difference did disease, and particularly plague epidemics, make to people's understanding of neighbourhood and their experience of neighbourhood?
Well, I think in both cases they represent, at least in the years before the Civil War, they represent the largest challenge there is to the idea of neighbourhood. And obviously there's a comparison to draw there legitimately with COVID today or AIDS in the 1980s. That neighbourhoods are being tested both by dearth and by famine. And some of those neighbourhoods collapse, and some of those neighbourhoods survive. And some of the neighbourhoods, the poor are squeezed out, left to die in the street, quite literally. One of the cases that I use in the book is the parish of St Oswald's in Durham, where the poor aren't anonymous. The parish clerk knows their name, and so you get references to, you know, John Smith died this day upon Elvet Bridge. You know, Jane Dodds died this day in the street in Elvet, and so the idea that the poor who are dying in the years of food scarcity, such as the mid-1590s, are anonymous, I don't think entirely holds water. These people are known to their neighbours, and yet they're left to die in the street. So neighbourhood is being tested by dearth, and similarly it's being tested by infectious disease. And it's give you another example this time from modern day Cumbria, Westmoreland, in fact, what used to be Westmoreland. There's a number of towns in Westmoreland where the plague impacts in the 1620s in a really intense way and wipes out almost half of the population. And the response of people to the plague is to try to stick together, to lower food prices where they can, to care for the infected. There's a conscious attempt to hold communities together in the face of plague conditions, which I think speaks to the power of neighbourhood. So there's, you know, again, these are sort of contrasting examples. St Oswald's, where the poor are left to die in the street, parishes in Westmoreland where communities try to hold together and to protect one another. So again, the story is about the complexity and the difference in people's responses to these massive tests to community solidarity.
So can you be a good neighbour without exercising generous charity?
I think you can if you're poor. Interesting thing is how many really poor people, when they die, when they produce wills, how many of them give tiny but significant grants of money to the parish church. You know, people who obviously live their life on the breadline, who are bequeathing 10 shillings to the parish church. So for the poor as well as the rich, there is this sense of investment in communities. And one of the phrases that comes out all the time in the material is about how the poor go from door to door, begging charity, begging for relief. And sometimes they'll get it and sometimes they won't. But I think for middling and richer people within communities, it's absolutely expected that you pay your contribution to the poor rate, that in conditions of food scarcity, but you invite your poor neighbours for dinner and feed them. That you kind of chip in, you do your bit, and if you don't do your bit, then you get frozen out of communities. So poor relief in that respect, I think, is like a sort of litmus test of lots of different aspects of social relations in the period that Steve Hindle's written about really well in his second book.
Yes, that's really helpful. Thank you. I've got another question from the audience here. Please do feel free to put your names in your questions. I'm wondering how the idea of neighbourhood evolved over the 15th and 16th century, and how this may have affected how neighbourhood acts as an inhibitor of conflicts.
Yeah, right. That's really interesting. Start the book in 1500 because my Latin's never really good enough to do the 15th century. And you get vernacular documents in great abundance from 1500 forwards, but also because I think, you know, the kind of Marxist within me tells me that something fairly decisive is happening in the late 15th and early 16th century to the economy, and that is the collapse of feudalism and the emergence on an incremental and micro level of capitalism, both in the countryside and in cities. And I finish in 1640 quite deliberately because I think that things changed dramatically as a result of the civil wars in all sorts of ways. My project will be to write a social history of the civil wars from the bottom up.
Yes,
point of view, experiences of war. That's what I want to do. So that's the reason for the periodization. But then within the book, I largely adopt a kind of synchronic approach, a thematic approach, which is probably, maybe I should have concluded a chapter that maps out the narrative, the arc in time, in the idea of neighbourhood. But I think that the point about neighbourhood is that it operates on a micro level. So every village has got its own story to tell, and it's therefore very difficult to chart the rise or the decline of neighbourhood. And certainly the concept is around in the 13th century. If you read texts like Piers Plowman, sorry, that's 14th century, but Piers Plowman is very much about rural communities holding together, the fair field full of folk. And I would say that there's a lot of continuity across the medieval early modern boundary in terms of the idea of neighbourhood. It would be interesting to have a medievalist write a book maybe that starts around 1200 and goes forwards, charting that idea of neighbourhoods, seeing where it comes from. But it's certainly there as a very powerful force right from the start of the book. But the funny thing is, although neighbourhood is there throughout the whole period and beyond, as a powerful social norm, people are convinced, ordinary people are convinced that neighbourhood is in crisis all the time. You find stuff from the 1500s saying, oh no, it's terrible, we're all on our way to hell in a handcart. We all hate each other, isn't it terrible? Just like you find stuff like that in the 1630s. So again, part of the coherence of this period lies in the conviction that people have, not just in neighbourhood as a good thing that they should all invest in, but also their conviction that it's in crisis.
Very good. Yeah, I hope that answers the question. I've got another question from the audience, which is, can you be a good neighbour if you are a young servant?
Yeah, good question.
Actually, I can see that taps into some of those questions about mobility and youth and possibly poverty. Do those people have the power to be part of a neighbourhood?
I think that they are part of a neighbourhood in the sense that they're still expected to follow certain social norms. You know, so drunkenness, for example, is frowned upon. Illicit sex is frowned upon. They might not have the same power within the community as their master or mistress might have because of age hierarchies, but also because masters and mistresses obviously are in positions of authority, matriarchal and patriarchal authority over servants and apprentices. But servants and apprentices are still part of the community. One of the cases that came across,
hierarchical household.
Sorry.
So they're not just members of a hierarchical household; they've got to fit into the neighbourhood as a whole. Yeah, that's good.
I think so. Yeah, I think so. there was one case I came across from Norfolk Quarter Sessions, which I used in the book, which was a case of a man who had beaten his servant so violently that the servant's bones were broken and his face was bruised. And the petition came from a servant's father, who lived in a different village, but had been told about how his son had been mistreated by this man, and was petitioning the Quarter Sessions for to bind him over for a recognizance, and to prevent him from committing any further acts of violence. So there are these interesting sort of limits on patriarchal authority, and the capacity of, you know, relatively humble people to limit the authority of violent patriarchs. So I think servants fit in despite their age. And in cities, if we go with what Paul Griffiths has to say in his first book, Youth and Authority, in cities it's clear that young men will gang together and go off and have drinking parties, particularly around Shrovetide, which can be quite a violent time for single women, whom drunken apprentices will set on and attack, because they feel that this is kind of customary entitlement that they have at Shrovetide to drive out what they see as prostitutes from the streets, which are often simply single women walking the streets. So there are these youth cultures that sometimes fit in neatly to ideas of neighbourhood, and sometimes in the case of youthful masculinity and violence don't fit in. So again, we're kind of back to complexity again, I guess.
I've got another question here, which is, can you tell us a bit about the linguistic origins of the term neighbourhood in your period?
Well, that's a great question. I can only say that having spent
book.
Sorry?
Without writing another book.
Well, yes, that's right. Yeah. It would involve writing another book, actually, that goes from, say, 1200 to 1500. But I don't have the necessary skills to do that kind of work in the medieval period. All I can say is that at the point at which I start writing the book at 1500, that the concept is there as a live and vital presence within the ways that people understand their communities. What I did do was do a word search on the term neighbourhood using early English books online, and it spewed out hundreds and hundreds of references to the usage of the term in all sorts of different contexts.
And could you see any process of change from that?
Not in the use of a terminology. No.
But it has, would you say it has broadly the same meaning all the way through the period?
I think so, yeah. Yeah. And I think, and again, this is why the 1640s really matter. I think what happens in the Civil War is that neighbourhood becomes a sort of an enclosed concept, as a kind of protective thing. And that's in part what the clubman movements are about in 1644 and 1645. They organise on the basis of local government administration, just like Kent's rebels had 100 years before. And communities turn in on themselves to protect themselves from marching soldiers committing atrocities and plundering them. And that's all the whole of what the clubman movement's about. So the 1640s represent a sort of acid test of people's sense of community, people's sense of belonging and support for one another. But that's not been written about by historians, because I think what's happened with the historiography on the Civil War is there's been a sort of fixation on high-level theological disputes and Puritan writings and the high politics of the Civil War, to the point at which, and all of this is a result of Civil War revisionism, with the result that ordinary people's experience of the war, how does the concept of neighbourhood survive the Civil War, for example. What was it like to live in a town under siege? What was it like to see your children or your father sent off to fight and potentially never see them again? All of those questions haven't been asked by historians of the Civil War, and I think it would make, you know, I think these are sort of big questions. So I think what happens in the Civil War is there's a reshaping of the pattern of social relations, basically. Now, that doesn't necessarily tie into Marxist narratives about bourgeois revolutions, but certainly the middling sort of people in the 1640s acquire much greater power, much greater administrative and political power than they'd had in earlier years.
Yeah. And would we include in that a reconfiguration of gender relations, whether short-term or long-term?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And Patricia Crawford wrote very powerfully about this in her idea of women's citizenship. You can see it very obviously in the radical movements of the 1640s and 50s. Women's prophesying in Quaker meetings. Women like Catherine Chidley, the London Baptist, who wrote that famous partly wrote that famous women's leveller petition, where they talk about themselves having an equal say in the Commonwealth. They're organised for women's demonstrations outside Westminster. Significantly, Chidley was a Baptist, so there's a link between radical religion there, political involvement, and women's agency. And I do think that the 1640s open up spaces for women's agency, which after the Restoration, the late Stuart state is trying to close down but can't.
Yeah. Yes, and there's also an argument that the memory of the world turned upside down is one of the things that precisely helps to encourage the narrowing of women's agency and the sort of circumscription of some of women's roles or some of women's public voices by that point. I guess in the Commonwealth period, the whole idea of Commonwealth, I think there's two things going on actually. There's obviously clear evidence of women like Baptists having a sense of a stake in the Commonwealth in the same way as earlier on they had a stake in the morality of the neighbourhood. But there's also a defining of Commonwealth and political relations in terms of fraternity, which is quite masculine in this.
Right, that's interesting. But as a counterexample to that, you know, there's that really interesting book by, is it Paula McDowell, Women of Grub Street?
Yeah.
Which points out very strongly the link between print culture and women's agency in the 1690s and 1700s.
Yes, I think that whole thing about the world of women in print shops is really important and interesting.
And also in hawking this stuff, in selling print, which is part of the point, and the links between sort of underground printing and Jacobitism and Toryism. So that in a weird sort of way, Toryism and Jacobitism again create spaces for women to articulate a critique of the world they're inhabiting. You know, the most famous example, obviously, being Mary Astell.
I'm just seeing a whole pile of questions that have just come in. One of them is, how do urban neighbourhoods relate to the traditional administrative boundaries we're familiar with, wards and the parishes and so on?
There's a whole book to write about that. You know, it's in the urban evidence that I've seen for a range of different urban communities, people recognise wards and parishes as organisational entities, but I don't think they necessarily see, especially wards, as meaningful spatial forms of social organisation. It's different with parishes. Going with Norwich example, Norwich has got I think about 40 parishes, which are many of which are very, very small. And it's clear that some people, from the Norwich Mayor's Court records, it's clear that some people do identify with their parish, not least because it's quite small. So if you walk down, say, Benedict Street in Norwich, for example, within 2 or 3 minutes, you will have passed through 2 or 3 parishes. So I think that the parish, the urban parish, does have more of an organisational, social organisational meaning to people than the ward, which is effectively about the administration of the city. But I can't prove that because I haven't done the work.
Yeah, you have to, how you do it. I've got a question from Jim Greenwood. Was the idea of neighbourhood affected by the change in the poor law from giving help in kind to paying toll? In other words, did you sense a change from charity-based relationship to a transactional relationship?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Absolutely.
It's really important. Yeah, I think the Poor Law Acts really are represent a very powerful rewriting of the relationship between poorer and middling people within communities, both urban and rural. And the same can be said for earlier 16th century poor law legislation, the 1571 Act, for example, which again, Norwich material, is very much based on the playing out of poor law systems on a local level, on the level of individual cities. And the 1572 Poor Law Act is very clearly based around the prior reorganisation of poor law in Norwich, and it's backed by Matthew Parker, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who's a Norwich man, and is very clearly tying together central legislation with local level initiatives, particularly that in Norwich, because he's very aware of it. So the poor law legislation, both the late Elizabethan legislation and the experiments in poor law that preceded it, I think are really, really important. And many of those experiments are taking place within urban communities in particular.
Really helpful. Simon Sandal asks, the book runs to 1640, finishing for obvious reasons before the chaos of the civil wars. We started talking a bit about this. Have you thought about the role or the influence of the neighbourhood as a potential conciliatory force through the upheaval of this period?
Yeah, well, hi Si, congratulations on the baby. Great to hear from you. Yeah, it's a good question. Again, I need to do the research properly to answer that question. So if you ask me in 10 years' time, by which time I'll be retired, hooray, and I won't have to deal with the research excellence framework ever again. That's when I'm hoping to get into the Civil War stuff. But my sense is that especially rural communities shut themselves down and close up communications with, certainly in the West Country, which is so heavily fought over throughout the Civil War period, where there isn't the sort of decisive engagement on one side or the other, but the Civil War just goes on endemically for year after year. I think that the communities in the West Country kind of shut themselves down. And again, that's much of what the clubman movement are about. I think the clubmen, who are often seen as kind of conservative neutralists, are much more interesting if you look at them from the perspective of a bottom-up history within the larger context of early modern popular political culture. But again, Civil War historians tend not to be interested in these kind of movements.
They should be. Charlie Taverner asks, how inclusive was this idea of neighbourhood? How were different sorts of immigrants and religious minorities, etc., fitted in? Very good question.
Yeah, it's a great question. And again, variety, I'm afraid, is the answer. So you got events like the famous Evil May Day riots in London in 1517, when there's an attempt of rising against the alien population with the intention of murdering them in much the same way as had happened in London back in 1381. So you've got instances of hostility to aliens that you can very easily find in the record. But then you've got examples like the arrival of the Huguenot silk weavers to Norwich and Colchester and London, many of whom write back to their relatives in the Low Countries, saying it's great here. These cities are really godly. We can listen to whatever preacher we want, and we can read all this religious stuff, and we can have our own parishes, our own communities. Again, the Norwich stuff points up very strongly the extent to which the Huguenots are contributing to the local economy. So the city aldermen write a letter to the Privy Council explaining how the silk weavers are to help to revive the textile trade in what is a very industrial city, and how happy they are to have the Huguenots in Norwich. So the answer is, it's a balance between the two.
Thank you. I've got a question from Ian Miller. Binding over is an interesting thing that local courts do with its flexibility and wide applicability. Is binding over a formalisation of social norms in a neighbourhood? And when is it used instead of informal means to restore the peace?
Yeah. Well, Steve Hindle wrote an essay about this in a collection that he and Paul Griffiths and Adam Fox edited called The Experience of Authority. He was writing about recognizances and the process of binding over. I've not really worked on recognizances, but my assumption would be that there's something that represents the end point after all other options have been exhausted of neighbourhood reconciliation. I know Don Birch, who's working with Laura on a PhD that's going to be really revelatory about conciliation and dispute settlement.